Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of my Kitchen Table Talks, in which I bring in whoever, and we have a real whoever today, in from the cold to come and have a cup of tea or coffee at the kitchen table. My guest today is Ryan Smith, who is the author of Spinning Wyrd, A Journey Through the Nordic Mysteries. And so welcome, Ryan.
Thanks for having me on, Ben.
Absolutely. Nice to have you on too. So for those of you who don't know who Ryan is, you may actually have seen, for those of you who've been following LlewelynCon over the past couple of years, Ryan presented at that. But for those of you in the US pagan community, you may have seen him at various places like Pantheacon and other festivals. For those of you who have no idea who he is, Ryan Smith has been practicing pagan since his teens, with over 15 years of experience in inclusive and anti-racist heathen spirituality. He is the author of The Way of Fire and Ice and Spinning Wyrd. The Way of Fire and Ice is part one of a trilogy, right, Ryan?
I mean, it's the first in what I'm writing so far, and we'll just see how
Perfect.
many books it ends up being.
Perfect. That's wonderful. I love it. I love it.
Yeah, just take it where it goes.
Love it. For some odd reason, I had it in my mind that it was a trilogy, maybe because I only work in trilogies and trees, but either way. Author of The Way of Fire and Ice, and of course, Spinning Wyrd, which is a second edition, or a second part of this. In addition to contributing to the anthologies Bringing Race to the Table and No Pasarán, Antifascist Dispatches from a World in Crisis, Ryan has been published in Huginn's Heathen, Patheos Pagan, and Truthout. He has presented talks and rituals at Pantheacon, the Gathering Paths presented by Between the Veils, Hexenfest, and Many Gods West. He regularly writes at onblackwings.com, which you can see just below his image in the video chat here, and produces a heathen podcast, The Wayward Wanderer. He also has a PhD in modern economic and social history and can be found online at Facebook, Mastodon, and Instagram. Of course, all of those will be in the show notes just down below. So welcome again, Ryan.
Yeah, it's great being on and great being at the table.
Wonderful.
So.
It's always interesting speaking with people from all over the place. I had Theo Gede Parma on a couple of weeks ago, and of course it's the summertime down in Australia. So although it's freezing up here in Canada, how is the temperature down there? I mean, we're recording in just before Christmas time. What's going on down there?
Well, I'm out in like the San Francisco Bay Area, so we're starting to get our somewhat proper winter on, which out here just means, rain and wind. But and it's sort of, I guess you could say it's kind of like picture Vancouver or Seattle, but like 10 degrees warmer sometimes. Something like that. Like I think there's been snow here like twice in my life.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. I mean, it's not as bad as, living in like winter in Scotland, well, particularly in Glasgow, where it was like, hi, this is sleet. But
is that where you went and studied? Were you in Glasgow for a while?
Yeah, that's where I did my PhD.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. It was also incredible for like, because like that's a thing that I think is so great about like going around to different places and having different experiences. That was when I truly understood, oh, this is why Yule and summer solstice were so incredibly important to people's living in this region of the world, because it got legitimately like darkest dark you could imagine by like 4 o'clock in December, and the sun wouldn't come back until like 9:30 or 10 in the morning. And then on the flip side, there's like 3 hours of sleep and you need blackout curtains to sleep in the summer. So it's just kind of like, oh, this makes a lot more sense now.
Yeah, it's true. It's funny, like where I'm in Ontario, people back home often think, oh, it's so cold, you must be so far north. But we're actually on the same parallel. Toronto is on the same parallel as the middle of France. It's like Burgundy, right? And meanwhile, looking up to the UK and especially Glasgow being much, much further north from that, it's a strange sort of thing, mainly because I think because it's quite mild there because of the jet stream.
Yeah. But yeah, it's our own particular getting into winter kind of situation that we're in now. And yeah, and just getting ready for Yule, getting remembering to wear the layers again and all that good stuff.
Wonderful. I
Yeah,
love it. I
just
love it.
yeah, just because like the Bay Area is in California doesn't mean it's like, LA weather or something like that.
Well, I've never been that far south before. The closest I've ever been, I think, was like northern, like really northern, like Kentucky, really like not that far south. But I don't think I could be in a place where there wasn't winter, like traditional winter.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's like it's being close to the water. Because there's just something about that kind of marine climate that, you can feel the difference once you get away from it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's nothing quite like salt air, is there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we're all, of course, where I'm at is very close to the Great Lakes, and so when we first came to Canada from the UK, you'd look at this big, vast expanse of water, and the salt air wasn't there, and it just felt it was surreal, like it was a very strange situation. Yeah, yeah. That leads me to my first question. So much of your work is about inclusive heathenry, or at least so much of your pagan work is inclusive heathenry, and particularly in developing practices that are in the here and now and not stuck in some saga from 1,000 or 1,500 years ago. I'm curious for you what it was like to, or what your journey has been like, developing your practice in the San Francisco Bay Area, being where you're rooted. I'm curious how that has affected your developing your practice and your outlook.
Well, I think part of it is that when it comes to like the question of like the particular area of where I'm in and what it's what that means for the practice, is that something that has, for me, it makes you have to think about your relationship to place and where it is that you are and what's around you, and thinking both in terms of how is this environment impacted by the actions of people, and how are there ways that things could be moving in a more sustainable or more nourishing kind of direction, because like we do have pretty good ideas of what those things look like even if we don't actively do them. Like we at least have some ideas of what could be better ways of living. And so that's part of it, is having experienced things like the like massive, like the cost of living in the Bay Area being what it is, like makes you really think about the connections between that and availability of things like open spaces and third space and all kinds of stuff like that, that it's thinking more about like that things like animism and those aspects of practice aren't just, okay, we're talking abstractly about nature that's out there. It's we're talking about like the world that's right in front of us and right around us, and what this means for us. And and also a part of that, I think, was influenced by what was going on and like pushing for more inclusive practice, because that's something that within like heathenry has had sort of a long reputation of being seen as kind of either a safe harbor for, or like active front for white nationalist and white supremacist groups. There's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, one thing I do think that's important to get out in front before I get into the dynamics that were at play, is based on best available behavior of things like, say, Jennifer Snook's work, and other research into like modern heathenry such as it is, the number of heathens who are most likely, or rather the percentage of the community that are most likely white nationalists, is a comparable number to the percentage of Americans who think that January 6th was justified,
Right.
which is about a third of the population. And I think that's, and I think, right, if you could get systematic surveys of the rest of broader paganism, you probably would actually see similar kind of attitudes and similar sort of results as well. And I think that's something that's important to get out in front first, is that I think the biggest source of these ideas within any of our communities is because these are prevalent in society.
Right.
And I don't think that while there are different expressions of how those things manifest and have worked within the community, the actual level, I don't think, of support is not significantly more than is the case with mainstream society, which really is more an indictment on mainstream society than anything else. But that said, because I think that's important to lead off with, that said, the environment within heathenry that allowed that to be the case was that for a very long time, like, this was something that didn't really start changing within the community until like about 10 or 12 years ago or so. The accepted wisdom was basically to not rock the boat and to not confront these kind of attitudes, or at least not do so openly. And this was something that I think, like, there's a lot of places where this comes from. Part of it is that there were like a lot of close personal relationships between a lot of the people who, like, you know, started the Osseter Folk Assembly and the Osseter Alliance and the precursors to organizations like the Troth and the ADF and other groups and stuff that were operating in the US and the UK, because these were at the time fairly small overlapping circles. Part of it is particularly in the United States, there was the impact of the Satanic Panic, which is something I think that we really need, like, as a community, like, all of us really need to consciously, like, maybe like find a way to go through and reacquaint ourselves with that history, because that's like the way that the Satanic Panic basically unleashed a moral panic of sorts that, I mean, literally, like, there were people who went to prison under false accusations of, you know, I'm not going to get into what the accusations were because, you know, we would need to put a content warning on the podcast, but just, you know, there's a great like, if you want to find out more, Behind the Bastards has a great short bit on it. So there's like a few other podcasts that have also done a really good job on that one. But without rehashing too much, it was sort of a general moral panic against a lot of things that were alternative in society. Like, and it wasn't just like, oh, we think this looks like, there were like Christian groups that were calling the Smurfs satanic propaganda. Like, this wasn't just like, you know, Dungeons and Dragons and stuff that looked like the occult. It was anything that went a little too far outside the mainstream, which, you know, again, included the Smurfs. At one point. So like, so that's, and that was something that, at least I know for like the US, different groups that existed in the US, that was a period of a lot of groups having to like really go underground. Like, they've been kind of, you know, small and like, you know, isolated and not as well known groups, you know, popping up in the 60s and 70s, but like the 80s is really when like a lot of the developing pagan community, like groups like the Covenant of the Goddess, were forced to move into a much more secretive posture than previously had been the case. And so what that also kind of does is, when you have this situation where large chunks of your community basically have to disappear, have to go into the closet, and hide what it is they're doing. And that is still, you know, a reality in a lot of the United States, in a lot of ways. Like, but when that happens, what that does is everybody sort of goes, well, we have to, like, we're sort of locked in this room together, so to speak. We're all locked in the closet together, so we may as well figure out a way to get along with everybody else in the closet without because those scary people are outside of the closet, without stopping and going, well, wait a minute, some of these people that are in here with us are not much different from the people who forced us in here in the first place. Like,
absolutely.
Like, when you look at the stuff that, like, say, groups like the Osseter Folk Assembly and the Odinic Rite, who are some of the biggest promoters of this stuff and have been for a long time, like, they're really not much different, practically speaking, from like, say, the more extreme ends of the Southern Baptist Convention at this point, just with, you know, a Viking paint job, Thor is Jesus, Odin is God the Father, and Loki's the devil. Like, you know, like, so that is also sort of part of where it comes from. I'm not saying that, you know, that justifies those circumstances, but it is important to understand that this was a situation of, there was a lot of outside pressure that had forced like the communities that had existed to go underground. And also it was not helped that the first, and it also has to be said that like the first organized heathen group in the United States was the Ossetru Free Assembly, which was the precursor to the Ossetru Folk Assembly, and was, you know, organized by white nationalists. Its first members were recruited in like places like Soldier of Fortune magazine and all kinds of other just, you know, not great stuff. So that's also part of it too, is that these folks have an organized head start on everybody else. So there was just this extended period of not rocking the boat, not challenging things too much, even when things got really obvious, like Kennewick Man in 1998, and folks can Google that whenever they like. But that sort of like created a climate of sort of, I wouldn't say like censorship, but more like a quiet, we're not going to talk about this, we're not going to discuss this, like the equivalent of the things that, like, for American audiences, like the things that one doesn't talk about at the Thanksgiving table or over Christmas dinner, but blown up to an entire like spiritual movement. And the thing that's not being talked about is, hey, Uncle Ron is spouting off some really bad things about Jews a lot, except except Uncle Ron is the largest organized heathen group in North America. So
it's a strange thing, because the rhetoric often came and still continues, I think, in some ways. They're not real pagans, they're not real heathens, they're not real, they're not us, and so we don't have to take responsibility. I remember a friend of mine up here in Canada, Jade Pichet, who was on the podcast previously, put together with her group the Canadian Pagan Declaration of Human Rights, and massive amounts of groups that previously had members saying, well, they're not really pagans, they're not really our group, they're not really part of us, we're signing this declaration. It was interesting then how the kind of cognitive dissonance there, right?
Oh yeah. And it's like, I think there is value in pointing out how what they do is very different from what the rest of us do, but they're not real heathens or thing, like, I'm sorry, we can look at mainstream Christianity and see how well that's worked for progressive Christians for the last 40 years, or rather how well it's spectacularly failed. Like, saying that, well, they're not the real thing is like, doesn't do anything to materially stop groups from doing what they want to do. Like, it is important to point out that in a lot of ways their theology is as different from like all of like baseline pagan theology, as well as like specifically a lot of inclusive heathen theology, in ways that would be comparable to like how there are some religious scholars who argue that the Mormon church is sort of on the most outside edge of what's considered accepted as Christianity, and depending on how you look at it, might even be better treated as its own unique religion. Basically sort of to that extent of, it's like, yeah, we're within the same very broad umbrella, but there's fundamental differences in how we understand things like the gods and the powers and the way that we approach the world and understand human morality and all this other stuff, that like it is like, what I'm saying is not, they're not real heathens. What I'm saying is, yes, they are part of this community and we have to recognize that and confront them. And part of why is because what they do is so utterly unlike what we do, in a way that is directly harmful to people on a consistent and systemic basis. Like, I mean, I mean, it's partly a sign of the times that we can't just say, well, they're Nazis. That's a good enough reason to say don't talk to them. But, you know, that doesn't really work in society anymore. But that also means we have to think through why. And the why still comes back to they espouse an ideology that advocates for race war and mass violence and all kinds of other stuff. So that's and also these groups are known to be incredibly abusive and cultish and high control kind of environments that are harmful to their own members. Like when you read interviews with people that have left white nationalist groups, usually the thing that was like the tipping point was the realization of, oh, the leopard is going to eat my face someday. I am actually not safe from the violence of this movement. Like, so yeah, it was like we had to, because so much of this stuff is all over the place, that's part of, like, we had to sort of do a hard reset on how we're approaching heathen material. And I know there's lots of other folks that did similar kinds of things in different ways starting around the same time. So this wasn't something that was unique. This was something that was like in the air and happening because there was a growing realization of, oh, there's a serious problem. There's a lot of unexamined ideas from them and practices that have been borrowed and picked up in ostensibly inclusive spaces. So it's, you know, untangling that stuff out and then saying, well, what is stuff that we can hold on to? What is stuff we can grab onto? And then build that forward to what we need now.
Beautiful. But I'm really curious in hearing that then. Do you think that some of the ways that the present inclusive heathen community practices and as you said, theology and their approach to the gods, the way that they see all of this, do you think that would have eventually come out without having to deal with the racism and white nationalism? Is this a reactionary piece, or is this a reclaiming? What would you say to that?
I think it's a reclaiming. Like, I think some of what happened was going to inevitably happen because like I mean, part of what was also going on in broader society, again, because we have to reflect back to that, is like, and this is something I also know from like my PhD work and having had a little peek behind the curtain to see how that all works, so to speak, that generally speaking, what is accepted consensus within the field of history, as in among academics, tends to be about it takes about like 10 to 20 years for that to filter out from academia into the broader public. So they're starting in basically the 80s and 90s, and particularly the 90s and 2000s because of the end of the Cold War. And like what that did was it like triggered a huge renaissance in early medieval and ancient archaeology throughout Central and Eastern Europe, because now there were dig sites all over the place in Eastern Europe and Russia and stuff like that were now accessible to Western researchers, as well as research and scholarship that had been done for years and years under the Soviet Union. And so that like triggered like a big, you know, revival in interest and a lot of new history and research that's like been challenging and changing how that time period's been understood. And that's also been happening while there has been sort of a growing reckoning within academia of sort of grappling with the past flaws of how history has been done and dumping a lot of like more Victorian and sort of national history kind of influence stuff, and instead moving much more towards like, you know, like complicating things and trying to understand things much more in terms of how people lived and how they understood their lives. So that was all that stuff was starting in the 80s and 90s and going into the 2000s. So by the time, like, say, you know, go back 10, 15 years in heathenry, that stuff is starting to filter into that, as well as other pagan spaces as well. Because you can see this with other pagan writing, that there was an increasing shift away from like uncritically accepting the conclusions of like Victorian and like Edwardian intellectuals and romantics, and actually interrogating them a lot more, and saying, well, wait a minute, this stuff was like written in the 19th century, so ergo massive sexism. Also, it might just straight up be wrong in several places. So I think some of that would have been inevitable, because similar things have been happening across like the pagan movement generally, because of those things that have been happening. And also because college education has become much more accessible and is also much more pursued than ever. So there's lots more people that get exposed to this stuff. So some of it's that. But I think that the particular form and the particular ways that reclamations had to happen have also been shaped by, like, would not have developed the way they did if it was not in an environment of facing a movement that is active, is organized, is aggressive, and has particular goals and objectives that they are pursuing. Like, if not for that, then things would have probably developed in a different way. But I think that, like, that may have probably accelerated the process a bit, I think, and it also did create much more of a need for sort of a hard break.
That makes sense. No, that makes sense.
Like, and also, you know, the internet making it a lot easier to talk to Scandinavian heathens was a huge impact too, because then, you know, we could, like, that's when you start seeing more interest in folklore and stuff start filtering into, like, say, the North American community, is also because of that. So it's very, like, a lot of things came together all at once. But the fact that this also was in an environment of confronting basically like a fascist cult has impacted that and made certain things a lot more necessary.
That piece around you know, actually interacting with kind of Scandinavian community and Icelandic community particularly. So many of my other heathen guests who have gone to Iceland, and friends in general, they've always said, and it really struck them, that for them when they went, it was always bizarre to them that people would be showing up in like pajama pants to ritual, and it was such a lived kind of experience, something that very much didn't happen in North America. And I've noticed that even within the Celtic sphere, I'm really connected with Druidry. Obviously, being British myself, I'm really connected with that aspect of my heritage. It isn't my entire identity, but I have noticed that there can be and please don't come for me, don't send me letters. I do feel that occasionally there's a need to almost LARP religion in the pagan community in North America. And you kind of hit on that connection between academia and the community over here. I'm curious for you then, what is the goal of your work? Because the first book, The Way of Fire and Ice, and Spinning Wyrd definitely really speaks to bringing it into lived practice. And so I'm curious, when you started to put together, you know, writings to be published, what was the most important thing for you?
The most important thing was making it something that was accessible and that people could just like pick up and go with it and start applying it and adapting it immediately. And also writing it to, is this is a tendency that generally exists in pagan writing. This is not bashing on anyone or something like that, yeah. But there is a general tendency within like some pagan writing, when they're talking about some of the more nuts and bolts kind of aspects, to write a little too much towards the aspirational end and not enough towards the, we are a disparate, isolated, and largely solitary practicing movement and set of communities. Like there isn't like I am one of those folks that I think you can say there's a pagan movement. I don't think you could say there's a single pagan community, so to speak. And that's just because it's so diffuse and disparate. And also a lot of those folks are definitely, you know, broke to varying degrees. So, you know, I think that's something that was part of what was influencing us going in, was the idea of, you know, if all you have is that you can get the book, then that's all you need. To be able to do a thing and get it started, and to be able to like particularly like address those like very real, like, you know, we're operating under very different conditions than like, say, any Christian pastor can like put out a shingle and say, hey, I'm opening a church, and they've got a reasonable expectation they'll be able to get a decent sized congregation as long as they're like reasonably competent and not boring about it. Whereas for us, it's, we're not living in a society that is tailor made to meet our needs the way that it absolutely is the case with a lot of mainstream religion. So that's like part of what's going in with this is saying, okay, we have to directly address this, and we have to work with this within that. We have limited access to material. We have limited access to resources, including like resources of community and organization. So it has to be written towards that level, with an eye towards hopefully growing things into something bigger. And when I was writing The Way of Fire and Ice, like that was part of why I put in the chapters about the community organizing stuff. And what I was expecting at the time was things were going to grow up slowly from like, local study groups and stuff like that. And then COVID happened. So instead, everybody was locked in and online all the time. So now instead it's getting the community that's developed around this a bit better organized and able to work in lights
you
just
went
changed.
green.
Yep, hold on, let me get that real quick. But like these LED strips are amazing, but there it is. So there we go. So like at this point it's about like getting a more organized community that we can help support each other, pool our resources, and do more and bigger stuff. Because I think that if inclusive community is going to grow, and especially in the circumstances that we're facing, because I mean we have to, part of why I brought up the satanic panic earlier is because we are in a new one now. Like I don't think that there can be any doubt that between things like the anti-trans stuff and all the like resurgence of incredibly militant like Christian nationalism, that we are in a place where we need to do that. And I think there's also enough of us, not just inclusive heathens, but pagans generally, that if we do find ways within our particular spiritual traditions and practices to get more effectively organized and find ways to effectively support each other and grow our own self-sustaining communities, that this time we may not have to go back underground. That there might, like, there was a, what was it? It was the Pew Research poll, like recently, like they do a study every year about like religion in America. And they estimated that there was probably somewhere in the neighborhood of like 3 million people who identify as witches or something similar in the United States as of 2023. Now that's like keeping in mind that the way that the mainstream institutions tend to understand what actually lives under that label is inconsistent and not always accurate. But I think that gives a pretty good barometer of if that's how big the witch movement is, and there's a lot of overlap between that and paganism, as well as like pagans who will just say, yeah, it's like that. It kind of gives a sense that maybe there's a lot more of us out there than there are. So I think at this point, what I'm trying to do more is like use what's in the books and what we're teaching through like the Fire and Ice community that's been developing to get something that's organized and not like, so that I can sit around and be a prophet or something like that. But so like
flashing beneath your name right now is not a prophet, just saying.
That's a lot of work.
I know. It is a lot of work. It is a lot of work.
Like,
yeah, it is a lot of work.
But like, it's like the point is more like, let's get something that we can help and support each other, something similar to like say what Reclaiming has done or like different druid orders have done, and get to that point so that we can continue, because to be not just to like, I mean, I'm repeating myself a bit here, but to be able to really make change in the world and really better live what it is we're practicing. Like I think that there is, especially in this time of like ecological crisis, there's a lot that heathen particularly, and also pagan, and which traditions can offer to the world, like ideas for how we should be approaching society and our relationship with the environment and our climate,
Absolutely.
and all of what that means. So I think that we have something that's valuable to offer and something that's powerful and important to share.
Yeah, I'm glad that you raised that, because that was one of my main questions for you. I've noticed that, particularly as I've been putting my own work out there and really connecting with people, there seems to be a trend where people are less and less inclined to take on labels for themselves. I see this a lot in the queer community, right? A lot of people in the folkloric community are taking on traditional craft or folkloric craft, mainly because it's a label that is so big that they can really insert and find themselves in. Same with the queer community, taking on that queer label that can be shifting and changeable and malleable. And so I'm noticing that, particularly teaching around the concept of Wyrd myself, and other forms of non-classical, non-Christian ways of looking at the world, I'm noticing that people are a lot more interested in taking on concepts as opposed to necessarily the religious context that they come from. So I'm curious for you, what I really appreciated within this book is you breaking down the concept of Wyrd, which can be, I mean, it's over the years, it's really meant so many things for so many different people. Many of those not really grounded in the actual culture and context, right? There was a passage in here that I really loved, and I'm getting to a question, I swear. I do want to share this passage, Will. So for Raven Rissy, the heathen views on death push her to live life more fully. She said, "It really makes you learn to live in the here and now, not worrying if I'm going to do all of these things and make sure I get the right outcome that I want before it's my turn to go. It forces you to say that you want to do these things, and then to do those things if you stay true to who you are and you're not purposely and intentionally hurting people or yourself." And that piece around it forces you to. I've noticed this, particularly with the concept of Wyrd. What is your, I guess maybe my question here is, this world view that you've devoted a whole book to, is it only for heathens? Does it offer something to the rest of the world outside of that cultural context? I hope that makes sense, that question.
I think it does. And the way that it does is that it, like for too much of like, particularly when we're talking like in the United States and Europe, but this has also then influenced the rest of the world, care of, you know, colonialism and capitalism and all those great other isms. But that when you look at stuff that comes from like a Christian epistemology, it is very, it tends to play like, you tend to see like more of an emphasis on particular abstract notions of what's important, of more abstracted virtue, if you will, of that there are certain kinds of actions that are always righteous because they fit within a certain category. There are certain circumstances that are always justified, regardless of their impact, and the consequences they have for the world. And this is, and also particularly like, you know, be fruitful and multiply, for yours is the stewardship of the earth, like like stuff like that treats like the natural world as something, like the world around us as something that's meant to be taken and used and consumed. Like that has roots in those ideas. And it's also, you know, and like industrialization and capitalism and stuff added their own particular nasty spins on that as well. But it's like too much of how mainstream society tends to function and the institutions of society function is based on the assumption of that you can separate out the consequences from the actions, and that you can, like, I'm sure this is something some listeners will love and others will go, please don't make it political, but you know, like the recent passing of Henry Kissinger, who has been a huge figure in American politics, has, like, in a just world, he would have stood trial for war crimes before I was born. Like, to be completely like, just to get right to the point, and you can see like the way that he was talked about in different media really gives a sense of what these ideas and stuff have done to how our society functions. Because the ones that were like, Rolling Stone, for example, had a great piece on him that was like, this guy did awful things and should always be remembered that he did awful things. Whereas there was a lot of other stuff like the New York Times or the Washington Post that were like, oh, he was a great statesman and he served his country and all this other stuff. And it's sort of like, well, wait a minute, on this side over here, we're talking about consequences and impacts. Over here, we're talking about the abstract, well, he inhabited this office, he did these important things and worked for these important people, so therefore he's worthy of respect. And that's something that Wyrd very much lives on the side of consequences and impact. Like everything that's about Wyrd is in terms of how are your actions impacting the world. And it's also like, and I know that there's like, some folks that will misinterpret what I'm about to say as moral relativism. I'm just going to say that right now before I say this. But what that then means is that you can't deal with moral and ethical questions in terms of just like, these things are always right, these things are always wrong, period, end of. You have to deal with it more in terms of, well, if I take this particular action, then I'm going to have to deal with the consequences of that action and that decision. Like that choice is going to have outcomes that I have to deal with. And am I prepared to deal with those outcomes and what they mean? Like that is and it's not something that says, therefore everything's relative and there's no right or wrong or whatever. It's more that it says sometimes a thing that may not be justified or appropriate may be necessary. Like one thing that I know about heathenry is heathenry, and this sort of sometimes is a point of contention with some other pagan traditions. Like heathenry is a tradition that has a very complicated and nuanced set of discussions around violence and the use of force, because at its core, from what we know within the lore and surviving source material rather, and what's accepted in heathen practice is that like for the pre-modern peoples, and also to an extent with like modern practitioners as well, it's accepted that if injury is done to you, you always have the option to take retribution on whatever terms it is you feel are most appropriate. Now, that's not always justified. Maybe sometimes going all out and like, I mean, like for anyone who's seen the movie The Northman, that's a pretty good example of stuff that comes up in the sagas a lot, of people that pursue that all the way to the point of destroying themselves and everybody around them. And there is a certain kind of like, I mean, on one hand, there's the, like the brosifs that take that superficially and go, yes, hard man doing hard man things. But what, like when you look at the broader genre and the broader context and like how these societies functioned, they kind of almost have an air of a cautionary element to them, of that even though these are actions that are justified and right within the view of these people, because they get caught up in these cycles of violence and escalation, it leads to destructive ends. So it is a much more like when you're coming in from that kind of tradition that particularly has like those views on that, maybe sometimes the use of force is justified, maybe sometimes it's necessary. Like I personally, like for example, I personally think that people who are in oppressed or oppressive circumstances are much more justified to use force than the ones who are doing the oppressive action in the first place. And because of that power disparity and those power dynamics and such, like I think like it is always more right for somebody who's like, say, if like say a queer person is like being targeted for a hate crime, they would be justified in using whatever force they think is necessary to defend themselves and the people around them.
Absolutely.
And also, maybe if they hear that there's like, a group of Proud Boys that's coming to town to take preventative action to like, say, get the community out to like, chase them out or whatever. Like, so that's something that I think is like basically both those things of embracing, that you can't really separate the action from its consequences. You can't separate the thing from what it does and how it impacts the world. And also that therefore means you have to take a lot of responsibility for what you do and how you respond to things. And you can't just say, well, but what I did was right because it was satisfying my honor, or I was just following orders, or whatever the thing is. It's like, well, yeah, you can say that may be how you justify it to yourself for what you did. You still have to live with and work through what those decisions wrought. And, you know, in a society where we separate those things out so much, I think that reinserting that connection and
I think that
reinserting that responsibility.
Oh, no, well, that responsibility piece is huge, right? That really comes through in the material. I recently had a chance to take a full class just looking at the Icelandic sagas, and when you really zero in on that piece around responsibility, I think in many ways that's why it's such a different worldview from the Christian or even classical view of fate. Is that idea of fate is so unchangeable, so just, you know, pray to God who has the power to change it. Well, no, the power is in you. But that idea of forethought, constantly looking forward to seeing, like, what is it, looking at the omens, right?
Yeah.
Do you think that people in our era now, I mean, if we're not looking at, you know, the like Botley and Kjartan or Hrefnkal or any of those people, right? We're looking at here and now. Do you think that modern people have an issue with personal responsibility?
I think it's more that the way that our society works is it's so good at externalizing and diffusing direct responsibility for some while concentrating it on others that it's really a fragmented mess more than anything else. That, like, for people who enjoy access to wealth and power and influence, there's always that understanding in the back of your head that unless you do something that hurts other wealthy, powerful, and influential people, you're probably going to be able to get away with it, or at least you're not going to suffer. Like, you know, it just, to use a really simple example, if you're somebody who makes $3,000 a month and is paying a third of that on rent, then getting that $200 speeding ticket is going to hit you a lot harder than somebody who is making like $8,000 a month and paying the same amount for rent. Like, not to put too fine a point on it, and it scales out in lots of different ways. Whereas then there's also then on the other side of it of people who are overburdened with responsibility of, like, you know, how, like, for example, folks working in the service industry have a much lower threshold for basically getting fired for misconduct from their jobs than like a lot of folks in certain, like, you could say higher up the food chain, kind of like managerial jobs and stuff like that. There is there's also like a different like there's just all kinds of examples of the way that works, as well as because the way like the big institutions of society work, like the direct responsibility gets really muddled as well, because on one hand we are all partially responsible for why the world is the way it is, in terms of things like our consumer choices perpetuating certain like harmful products or methods of production and distribution or stuff like that. But at the same time, we don't have very many choices in how we do that. So like it is really a mess of, on one hand, and like when you look at, like, say, a lot of like the mainstream discussion around climate change, like solutions, it tends to focus a lot more on, you should put solar panels on your home, you should get an electric car, you should only buy from ethically sourced, blah blah blah. Like, it's very individualized, and it's very, the responsibility is on you, and it shifts the blame towards like the individual, instead of recognizing, hey, this is mostly driven by a very concentrated group of industries that are extremely wealthy and powerful and influential, and they have been happily using that wealth, power, and influence to delay and downplay climate action for longer than either of us have been alive, at least. So those are the people that are the most responsible for our current circumstances, but instead they're allowed to basically get off the hook. So I think that that's part of why it's so slippy, because I mean, we see like the usual suspects in the media that go, oh, personal responsibility and all that up by your bootstraps stuff is dead. It's like, well, it's more the people who have to actually be responsible for the consequences of their actions are the ones that have the least means to do something about their circumstances and the consequences of their actions, whereas the people that have the most means to do so have the greatest ability to evade it.
Absolutely.
Like,
And that's
and that
across the
is
Western world.
Oh yeah. And like, the heathen answer to that, I guess you could say, if we're going to go to the history for a minute, is, in the Heimskringla, there's this incredible bit where around the year 1000, I forget which king it is, but it was the king of Sweden at the time. And the Swedes had been at war with Norway because the king of Sweden also wanted to be the king of Norway, as happened a lot in medieval Europe. Like, I think Sweden and Denmark, as well as Sweden and Norway, are like within the Guinness Book of World Records for the most wars between a couple of countries in his recorded history. But without without getting into that particular thing too much, that like, so what was going on there was he was trying to do that, and he had to go before the Ting of all Swedes, which was basically sort of like this big combination popular assembly and law court, and these things were all over the tings rather were all over the place in Scandinavia in this time period. And like, really, like, even post conversion and early modern Scandinavian history is defined by the seesaw between the remnants of these popular institutions and the institutions that succeeded them, like the Riksdag in Sweden, and the power of the monarchy. So that's like a thing that isn't just unique to the paganism, but it comes from those times. So he had to go before them to basically talk his people into continuing the war. And after he did his whole, like, I am your king and I demand your obedience and that you blah blah blah, all that usual kind of king type stuff. Then after he gave his speech, then a man named listed as Thorgny Lagman, which denoted that he was a law speaker. And what law speakers was they were people who were responsible for reciting the laws of the Ting at the open of any Ting assembly. And they also kind of sort of worked as like, mediators and lawyers. And they were just sort of like, the all-purpose legal experts of the society. And people who had previously served at this in this position were held in high esteem. So he then stood up, and then, to give a short version of his speech, like the full thing is in the Heimskringla, he says, well, King, I'd like to tell you a little story. And that story starts with, over yonder is a bog. And in that bog lie the bodies of 5 other kings who tried to make us do things we didn't want to do. So we got sick of them and threw them in the bog. And then he says, it's not that we don't want to fight for you. We'd love to, invade Estonia or something like that. But we're sort of done with this war with Norway. It's not going anywhere. No one's benefiting from it. And then the next thing that Snorri then follows that with is, and his speech was met with shouts of acclaim as members of the Ting banged their swords and spears on their shields and affirmed their support for his position. And shortly after, the king was forced to go and make peace. I
love it. I love it.
Just putting that out there, that if we're going to look for like a historical example of how to do responsibility differently,
yeah, it's funny how often things change very quickly when kings are threatened. I mean, Charles the Second, right?
Oh yeah.
yes. So that piece around then personal responsibility, collective responsibility, because that comes into this concept of Wyrd. I know there are academics who've written entire books about just the idea of the tapestry image when it comes to Wyrd. Can you speak about that connection point? Because I think that's really important for people to, that will help people to understand this concept.
So what's interesting about it is, like, the tapestry image comes from a couple of different places. Because there isn't exactly like a there isn't a source that specifically says the Norns weave everybody's Wyrd into a great tapestry or something like that. There is like a common bit of heathen lore, although I haven't really been able to chase down a historical source for this one, that Frigg is said to have a great tapestry that shows everything that is and ever was and is constantly being woven within her hall, although I have not been able to find a source for that. There is like mention in places like the Locasena of Frigg knows all but speaks little. So the place where weaving sort of comes into it is and sort of this tapestry image is because the verbs that are used for describing this process within the language, as well as the imagery that's associated with it, is very associated with spinning thread. And there's like, particularly I'm talking like, you know, a drop spindle kind of thing, which is like there's some folks like who have theorized within like the heathen movement that the sort of hypnotic kind of effect this has may have been one of the things that was a source for the invention of scythe, for example. And the particular verb to spin that's used is the same one that's used for like a spider spinning out silk. So it's very like, it's this idea of taking things and threading them together into something, and by that way basically sort of spinning something into existence. And it's how that sort of then relates broadly to like sort of the tapestry imagery that's emerged around Wyrd is it's essentially that like our lives and what it is we're doing become threads within the greater tapestry of everything else. Like and what we do with those threads is constrained somewhat by the circumstances of the tapestry that we're within, but we still have freedom to determine to an extent where we want to go within that tapestry. Like, and there isn't anything that predetermines what will be. I mean, like, you know, we'll all die someday. Entropy's just like that. But there is a lot more, and you know, like someone who is born in Paisley is not going to have the same options as somebody who's born in Chelsea. But like, all in all, we still have freedom within that space to do as we can and as best we can to shape our lives. And also like that idea of spinning, of that it's an active thing that you're doing, that it's not just oh, I'm just going along with the flow. Like it's something that you participate in making it happen.
Absolutely. A very different worldview from, say, again, the classical or the Christian idea of predestination, of it's always fated to happen, and therefore the only people who have, or the only being who has power of that is God or the fates in that case. That piece then around kind of the unveiling of the tapestry, that it's continually unfolding. Can you talk a little bit, and we are coming up to time, unfortunately, but can you talk a little bit about then how that can translate into somebody's lived life now? Because I feel like anybody who's going to pick this book up is going to be interested in how they can apply that to their life, not necessarily just in like you know, if they happen to be reading the sagas or Snorri stuff. Can you speak to that?
Sure. I think what that means for people living now is by approaching life and circumstances from this frame, it gives you a lot more agency. It because it shifts the focus to cause and effect and the relationships between things. It allows you to much more like act deliberately within your life, that you're not just saying, well, I'm at the mercy of these greater forces. It's like, yes, there are these greater forces and other things that are out in the world, but you can still do something about that. You can still shift and move within that space, and you could even potentially change how those greater forces impact you and impact the people around you. Like everything can change. We have seen like the world change in the blink of an eye before, and it could easily do that again. And you know, when you live in a worldview that says even God's world's planes of reality will one day burn to be replaced by something new, it does, I think, on a psychological level, make it easier to confront and challenge things that are harmful or destructive, of knowing, well, nothing is actually going to last forever. Nothing stands beyond the power of human action.
Mm.
I mean, things like, maybe gravity or something might be a little harder, but
Very true, very true. That's a really important piece too, because I mean, it's interesting how that is navigated by worldview. The Christian worldview would have a very similar look at, but it would be the idea of, well, I'm going to be saved, right? As opposed
yeah,
to the Nordic, Scandinavian, heathen worldview, which is, again, not really sure when Ragnarok is going to happen. We know it's something is going to be happening at some point, but it's that living in the moment, right?
exactly. And we can also
Mm-hmm.
that, like, it is telling that Odin's response to Ragnarok is not to submit to it, but to continually try to seek answers and information about it and try
Yeah.
to do something about it. Like,
Mm-hmm.
just because something is inevitable and is always, like, was always going to be coming down the pipe, doesn't mean you just have to accept it.
Mm-hmm.
And like, even if all you can do is shout your defiance in the face of whatever it is that ends you, at least you can have that measure of agency
That's
and that
true.
tiny bit of freedom.
It's that I read somewhere, somebody, I think it maybe Jackson Crawford had said this. It's that kind of stepping into potential, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. As I'm a big fan of Jackson Crawford. I'm not sure how you feel about him, but I'm a big fan of his. Now we're coming up to time, unfortunately. I really appreciated you coming and speaking with me today about this. I'm curious about then this book particularly. What
Mm-hmm.
was your favorite part of this? Was there one thing that you absolutely loved?
I think a couple things. I think, like, putting in deeper stuff on Scythe, particularly on the Udiseta discipline of Scythe.
Mm,
That was something that was like really like great to put in, and that was based on work that I've done with like people in classes and stuff. So it's sort of refined from what was originally in the first book.
mm,
It was also like thinking about the cyclical kind of reality that you get with things like Ragnarok and the creation and recreation of existence.
right.
Like, and thinking about, well, what does that mean for us? Like, what does it mean that these things are always changing?
Mhm,
Um, and sort of wrestling with those implications, as well as ways that are like, like, I'm not trying to say Ragnarok is embedded in cosmic reality, therefore it shows up in all these other places. It's more like, well, no, the logic of Ragnarok makes sense given
mhm.
all these other things that we
Right.
know could broadly follow a similar pattern.
That makes sense. That makes sense. That's wonderful. Very quickly then, what are you working on next? Can you tell us about your next project?
Um, right now it's getting the Fire and Ice community into a more cohesive organization. Like, we are going to
Mhm,
be um doing stuff like an apprenticeship program, and we've got a pretty active Facebook group and Discord server.
mhm,
um like, getting more folks up and posted out on Black Wings, and seeing if we can get together some like bigger in-person events.
mhm,
I'm also thinking broadly about some like about what the next books might be.
mhm,
And there's a couple of different places it might go.
mm,
But that's sort of a letting that percolate and come together, and then and like, see also what comes out of like the community building stuff, and like trying to offer more classes and all that
mm.
good stuff. So yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. For those of you who are watching the YouTube video, of course, down below, Ryan there is his website. Go and check out his socials. Go and check out the classes that he has on offer. Go and check out Spinning Weird and the previous book for Way of Fire, if this interests you. There's a wonderful book, particularly The Spinning Wheel. I really appreciated that book. because of how you really broke down the concept. I really appreciated that. Because I feel like there can be a real disconnect between people who are just venturing into the sources and the whole culture within like the very particular historical context to it, and then how to apply it to life now. So I really appreciated that. Do you have anything that you'd like to plug coming up? Anything in particular? This, of course, will be coming out in February. Anything coming up in March or the summer?
Well, I'm gonna have some new stuff coming out on my podcast. And I will hopefully be like getting some book tour related events coming up soon, and whatever information for that you could find at On Black Wings. And I'll also like probably be announcing stuff through the Wayward Wanderer, which is my podcast, as well. So
wonderful. I look forward to listening to that. So Ryan, thank you so much for joining me on this. We're recording on Tuesday night in the middle of December. For those of you who are listening, thank you so much for coming. I've been Ben Stimson. This has been Ryan Smith, and I hope everyone has a good rest of the day. Goodbye, folks.